Días.
Pues ya estamos.
Introduce, yeah, I think, okay. Bueno, in Spanish and then I will translate. Buenos días a todas y a todos. Es un gusto tenerlos. Y la razón por la que tenemos esta reunión es, tal como se los hizo saber la coordinadora del posgrado, la doctora Carla Valverde. Tenemos la oportunidad de tener en México a Mark Bevir. Mark Bevir vino en el marco de un grupo de trabajo que tenemos en Comexo, Mexicano para Ciencias Sociales y Humanidades. Es un grupo que coordino junto con la doctora Eliana Arancibia sobre gobernanza. Seguramente ustedes sabrán que Mark Bevir es un especialista importante en gobernanza. Tuvimos un evento en Mérida la semana pasada y Mark lo invitamos como el key speaker en Mérida. Y ya después de eso él nos comentó que quería tener algunas actividades académicas acá en México, y una de estas actividades es este diálogo con estudiantes y con colegas en la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. Una breve introducción del profesor Mark. Él está adscrito al Departamento de Ciencia Política en la Universidad de la Universidad de California en Berkeley. Distinguido, es coordinador del Departamento de Estudios, del Centro de Estudios sobre Gobierno Británico, y pues es un especialista muy importante. Lo que a nosotros nos interesaba es todas las cosas que ha escrito sobre gobernanza. Tiene varios libros publicados sobre gobernanza, teoría de la gobernanza, el Sage Handbook of Governance. Tiene también un libro que estamos tratando de ver si podemos ya traducir al español, que se llama Gobernanza Democrática. Entonces, bueno, pues en este marco, el profesor Mark Bevir hizo un viaje de un par de semanas a México, y ya finalmente el día de mañana se regresa a Estados Unidos. Pero antes tenemos la oportunidad de tener este diálogo. La idea que lo que platicábamos, tanto el doctor Mark Bevir como la doctora Carla Valverde, era pues más que una presentación y una conferencia y un speech largo por parte del doctor Mark Bevir. Probablemente para muchas y muchos de ustedes era más interesante pues tener de arranque un diálogo, ¿no? Entonces le llamamos, no sé si ustedes conocen esta expresión en inglés, con los grupos de rock y de música. Muchos de ellos hacen una cosa que se llama meet and greet, que es como conocerse y preguntar de una manera más como informal. Entonces, un poco la idea del formato del día de hoy es así. Dudas sobre teoría, dudas sobre metodología, dudas. Si quieren, también es muy válido que hagan una muy breve introducción sobre lo que están trabajando el día de hoy, investigaciones, y pues Mark, con todo gusto, tendrá una reacción sobre esto que estén planteando. So, Mark, very welcome to UNAM again. This group is comprised by professors and also students from the postgraduate studies in social sciences and political science. And our colleagues, they know that the format it's a dialogue. I explained to them the context in which you came to Mexico. This is the first time for Mark in Mexico, so it was also something special for Mark. Basically, that's it. So we'll start with the dialogue. I will give you the word. And the thing is, it's to have an exchange, a fluid exchange. I let our invitees know that they can ask questions about methodology, about theory. Also, Mark offer a conference on interpretative approach to political science and public administration last Thursday. But also, that's a topic in which Mark can talk with you in the different things that you are doing. And I also let them know that if they want to give a short idea of the project in which they are working, that's also possible, and you will react in every question and answer. We have, tenemos algo así como 2 horas. Pero Mark me comentó antes de llegar que si nos extendemos un poquito más, por él no hay ningún problema. The only thing is that he's injured. He walked like 20 kilometers on Friday in downtown and in Bellas Artes, and he's a little bit injured. So the only thing is that he cannot stand up, but he told me that if we go a little bit longer from 11:30, which is the schedule that we have programmed, there's no problem with that. So feel yourself free to have this dialogue with Mike. So basically, this is everything from my side. So guys, shoot. You are free to shoot right now and start this dialogue with Mark. And I insist, if somebody needs help with translation or with interpretation, everybody can help. Who wants to start? My former professor in political science faculty, Dr. Camille.
40 años, ya 2 opciones usadas en enfoque grande.
¿Quieres que vaya traduciendo?
Sí.
The professor Samitis is talking about that 40 years ago there was 2 approaches in political science, like very struggling very hard within them.
Era el funcionalismo y el marxismo.
Journalism against Marxism. Marxism.
What was the first one?
Functionalism. Yeah.
En el siglo XX, estaban a desarrollarse más enfoques. Y ahora, desde mi punto de vista, han cambiado.
Yeah. So the professor says that the thing is that after during the 21st century, the panorama of social sciences approaches and methodologies have been complexed, made it more complex. So we have many options, much more options right now.
Iniciado el siglo XXI, pluralizaron los y ahora se han hibridado mucho, lo que llamamos de disciplina. ¿Qué piensa usted en relación a esta diversidad de enfoque y la complejidad que supone los objetos de estudio a los que nos enfrentamos hoy? Teniendo en cuenta que la sociedad ha cambiado en 40 años.
Thank you, Dr. Samiti. So, Dr. Samiti says that these 40 years has been a process of complexity within social sciences, within different approaches in social sciences. And in the last 20 years, we have seen the growth of interdisciplinary approaches which are needed in order to deal with more complex research objects within social sciences. So Professor asked, what's your opinion in this process of changing in approaches of social sciences?
First is that I think in some ways you'll see a lot of functionalism and Marxism, but all different against the great what you say.
No, sí comprendes inglés, ¿verdad? Ya, claro, sí.
I think we still see a lot of functionalism and Marxism, or at least the tendency. I think one dramatic thing has been the impact of neoclassical economics and rational choice theory across the social science. And they're very powerful today, whereas they vary. But I think the reaction of mainstream science often drawn on either functionalism or Marxism. If we look today at the various approaches that go under the label institutionalism, I think that the types of explanations and stories they tell often rely on either functionalism or Marxism. So sometimes institutions are explained by their function, or an activity is explained by its function within an institution. So there are still a lot of functionalist explanations there. And at other times, I think Marxism has lost its confidence. I'm British, and there's a very famous British Marxist historian called Eric Hobsbawm, and after power, he wrote an article called The Marx of Labour Hall. I think communism, Marxism, socialism all lost the sense that the world was moving in their direction. And I think you still get a lot of explanations that are indebted to various Marxist ways of thinking. You see that in more formal sociological explanations about Fordism or post-Fordism. Basically a Marxist premise. It's about how there are different ways in which you can stabilize the inherent instabilities and contradictions. I also think that there are all sorts of looser post-Marxist approaches that draw on the new left and attempt to rethink Marxism, to recognize its Hegelian background, put it away from communism and Stalin. And I think those trends appear in discourse theory, post-structuralism, postmodernism. I think functionalism and Marxism by background was an awful lot of those. Having said that, even if we put rational choice theory and neoclassical economics here, I think we realistically, but in my opinion, sadly, live in a world in which the American United States is very dominant, particularly within the social sciences. It exercises a powerful hegemony over the rest of the world. The rest of the world, even big countries like Germany, are increasingly, it's prestigious to sell your research and publish it within America. So there's naturally a drift towards American ways of doing things. And one of the effects of that, and the main effect of that, I think, has been a deviation in the way in which social sciences talk in theoretical terms. Whether they're talking in terms of functionalism, Marxism, post-Marxism, institutionalism, anything. I think that the explicit theoretical drive behind their agendas is less prominent than it used to be, which I think is what you're noticing in common. Instead, there's been a shift to the idea that you can have neutral methods which are more important than the theoretical impulses behind your research. that means that I think social science today is increasingly swamped by the legacy of behavioralist and positivist quantitative methods, big data, correlations, regression analysis, etc. So that's how I see it. I'm not very good at prediction. I'm really not. But I'm fairly pessimistic. I think that I don't like the change I've just described, particularly the dominance of method, but I think it will get worse and worse rather than better.
Mark, if you want me to project some of the slides of your last conference, also, and if you would.
No, let's keep the conversation. Say that if anyone would like to see the slide, they can email you and you can send the slide on.
Ya, le comento esto a Mark porque la conferencia del jueves pasado está muy relacionada con estos temas. Entonces, ya hay slides muy claras sobre varios de estos puntos. Entonces, con todo gusto podemos compartir también los slides. Y va a estar también disponible en línea la conferencia. Entonces, también les compartimos el link. Bueno, muchas gracias, doctor Samitis. Nombre, por favor.
Rubén, Rubén Serrano, I came from Security Service. This is one institution, no profession. I hope that we see to you well. So I'm working in a relatively new theory, which is descriptive discrimination. I don't know if you can like recommend us or recommend me some like a technique or a perspective for work methodologically with political discourse related with policy. And also, I don't know if you can like develop, I don't know if your work regarding the narratives and ideological perspective and political discourse which affect the policy.
Okay, I have two answers.
Okay.
I'll try and keep the first one short, and it's what I personally, but I'm reluctant to tell people to do what I would do, and I think there's a broader answer which might be more helpful. If you were me, this is what I would do. Underlying both answers is actually something I just said, which I think that of our social science are the theoretical agenda we bring and that inspire our questions and our attempts to then try and expand those theories. So because I tend to work with very humanist and historical theories, I tend to see the world in very much informal terms about people acting for reasons of their own in complex practice. What I would do is look for, probably I would try to find at least 2 or 3 different discourses so that I had a sense of context and conflict going on in the practice. I would try to find out those discourses through any data I could get. So that might include written text, it might include oral interviews, it might just include what. Anything like that, I would try and get a sense of what I thought their beliefs were. And then I would try to ask, where do those beliefs come from? Why do they have the beliefs they do? And for me, and this ties in with the post-Marxism, so when I was younger, I very much identified with the British New Left, but I've kind of drifted quite a long way away from that Marxism now. And as a result, I would not look for an explanation that tried to explain these different discourses in terms of, say, social class or gender or other such. Then I would ask, what historical conditions lie behind? And I think it's reasonable to be quite pragmatic there and say what you're doing is you're constructing a historical to explain the object of the discourses that you found. I don't think we should ratify discourses so we have to look at, say, liberalism, socialism, conservatism. You might find very diverse. So, for example, when I was in America, we were talking a bit about water governance in the Yucatan. And clearly one of the discourses that plays a strong role there is the discourse of Mayan self-government. So you might find discourses that are very specific to the area of conflict you're looking at, and you might trace those historically. And I think part of the reason I would want to trace them historically is to denaturalize, which I mean suggests that they're historically contingent, that they're not inevitable, that they're contestable, and thereby kind of offer a certain sort of critique of them, or someone like Foucault would call a genealogical. So that's how I would go about it. Right? So I think the key thing for you is to have a strong sense of the theoretical perspective that you believe in. So you might believe in a stronger Marxism, that's just one example, in which case your explanations will obviously be more Marxist than the ones I've given. So I would still reconstruct the discourses the way I described. But then I think the sorts of explanations you would be looking for would be more around conflicts created by the structure of capitalism within Mexico. Likewise, you might have a more functional explanation, in which case you would, again, reconstruct the discourses using text, interviews, etc. But you would then try and ask what functions these discourses play within the social whole of which they are a part. Right? So I think that what you really want to do is try and form a commitment to a theory and let that theory drive your research. And that emphatically does not mean that you're trying to prove the theory. What you have is a theoretical agenda. Drives the research to do, and then at the end, you reflect on what your own empirical research has told you about that theory, how you need to modify the theory, how you need to expand the theory. And if you do that, then your research makes a theoretical contribution rather than just being something that's logically written.
Thank you very much. And this,
¿Nos dices tu nombre, por favor, y tu institución?
claro, muchísimas gracias. Soy Gabriela Morales. Recently, I work for the faculty of political science faculty here and in the degree of political science. I am a professor on methodology, but for the job. That's a great challenge. But my research, my actually research is related to political, to the reform to the judiciary in Mexico that recently has taken place in Mexico. That is, I was thinking very fast when we were talking about the analysis on discourse and how to try to merge theories and something to not to prove them, but to sustain the things that we are working in the discourse. My very specific question related to that, well, the two questions. The first one, are you familiar with this process in Mexico, the judicial reform?
Not much.
No.
Tell me about
Okay. In Mexico, this is a big discussion. It was a big controversy because you have the two
Power.
powers, the legislative and the executive, going ahead when over the judiciary. Then, and in very fast terms, they changed the judiciary in Mexico, then making the judges and in all the of government elected by vote. So there is also the discussion about the electoral democracy and the representative democracy with the legal democracy, you know, and the part of the government. So, of course, in the judiciary was something that was involved. But there were several spaces of dialogue, for example, to try to legitimize what they have been. So my question was related to the parties. How do you think the reverses powers, brute powers, has to be taken into consideration in governance? Because we saw some sobreposición. Overlapping from the one that has taken the decision and to the other ones that were going to try to comply the decision. In this judicial reform, one of the most important things that they had something that was done as judicial professional service. They said no, you have to go to some win the elections to remain in the position. That was a very part for some important sectors. Then they have to take a decision in terms of functionalism, but in the latest functionalism of humans, not persons, with the communication and empathy. With some of other colleagues that there were también some divisions in some of the distinct groups that were like, for example, in the judiciary, they were coming together until they had to decide on the authority get apart, and some went in one way, some went in another way. But that has to be with many aspects that personal that maybe you have no about.
Yeah, I obviously know little about next. It seems to me in general that we sometimes don't like to acknowledge this, but there's a clear distinction between liberalism and democracy. So liberalism is committed to a social balance, including rule of law, respect for rights, etc., etc. Technical, but there's a group of them really stand for civil society, tolerance, non-authoritarian government, and those would be liberal values. Democracy might or might not lead to a set of policies all those values. So it seems to me that historically we almost have two different visions of democracy play out historically since the early 19th century. The first will rise as representative. Representative democracy in many ways, particularly when it's tied to the separation of power, is about trying to limit a more radical victory, trying to put barriers between popular decisions and outcomes. Those barriers tend to ensure, or help to ensure, democracy generates liberal outcomes. I think I could tell you about that in Britain, but the most obvious case is the American. So if you read the Federalist Papers, they're actually a very conservative document. They're overtly about trying to restrict the more democratic energies of the American Revolution in order to ensure more stable liberal outcomes. You can see that in the Constitution and the role of the Supreme Court, which are meant to prevent democracy generating the liberal outcome. So that would be representative democracy. Later in the 19th century, arising out of radical movements and socialism, you get a vision, you get the idea that representative democracy is actually strengthens elite, failed to deliver on the social goals that more revolutionary attempts aimed at. So radicals and socialists start to commit themselves overtly to more participatory forms of democracy. We have those going through history then of democracy, those two models. Right? And it's quite complex because the fact that socialists and radicals support or participatory forms can mean that they end up supporting, they think that what's going to arise is going to be good. But from a legal perspective, what arises can be forms of populism that at least drift towards authoritarian. So you need to think about these two models, I think, democracy and the different models they give between. And the first one, representative democracy, the judiciary will generally be an external force. It's there to constrain and control democracy through the legislature and the executive branch. And it's meant to reinforce dominance, probably liberal, probably constitutional values. Whereas it's not participative democracy. Judiciary is seen as a family and a social role. But it's there to protect the interests of the people. And it needs to be challenged by, say, bringing in popular election judges. Right? And you can therefore see in the history of democratic thought the basis of those two ideas. So if you're looking at those within Mexico, you're going to have those two possibilities. And then I guess the open question to you is how cynical you are about why politicians are supporting whichever of those models they're supporting. So are they, for instance, supporting the election of judges because they are genuinely trying to create a social utopia in which there will be a reduction of poverty, etc., etc.? Or, this will be one question, this will be about social goals versus, let's call it, private interest. Or are they trying to do so in order merely to enhance their own power? Is the discourse, is the discourse something that when you see it, you think that's genuine? Or when you see it, you think it's a strategic discourse which is private? Then the second question goes back to this value debate. So you have to think for you have to decide for yourself whether you think that the opening up of the judiciary is something that really is likely to bring about the sorts of goals that the radical leftists want. The 1830s in Europe, the radical left hoped to produce through a more radical form of democracy. Or do you think that at least under certain social conditions, worrying radical left or a radical left vision of democracy might actually open the door to authoritarianism? I mean, look at Trump. Trump is elected, right? He has a popular base quite clearly, and he actually walked away from the last election. Right? So it's not always the case that democracy and increased democracy is going to create good things. The voters are. See, this gets back to what I was saying earlier about Marxism and the left has lost its faith that things were moving in their direction. I think originally, when the radical left supported participatory forms of democracy, which would have included not just election of judges, but election of senior civil servants, then they were confident if you just got rid of the power of elites, the people were naturally virtuous. And they were naturally, in a sense, inclined to pursue their own interests correctly. And in that sense, opening up democracy would create a better world. I think today, many on the left, to me, are quite skeptical. We actually think that, we think, A, you're never going to do away with power and elites. Those are always going to be around. And B, there's no guarantee that the people are actually going to pursue the goals you want. They are always liable to drift into far-right ideologies that you don't like, more authoritarian measures that you don't like. They're particularly inclined perhaps to xenophobia, think of Trump in America, xenophobia, racism, anti-immigration, anti-immigrant stance. I think there are at least those two questions. One, we see that drift towards the election of judges, is it sincere or is it self-interested? And the second is, generally we help to realise liberty and social goals, or how concerned are we that instead it will drift into a populist authoritarian?
Very much. And with
So am I.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Hi.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Tu nombre, por favor.
Yes, I am Gabriela Suer. I am professor here in the program, and I am researcher in technology and society, and came here maybe to ask about how do you see the current artificial intelligence governance considering in the imbalance parts in big techs and governments, and I work with not secure or I the local artificial intelligence. So it's very difficult for me to make a system around a scenario where such a imbalance of our intelligence. The other point.
Well, personally, I would think the old left Mark, right? So the old, very old left Mark. I don't like the leads. I don't like power. I don't like huge concentration of wealth. And there's no doubt whatsoever that big tech now is a concentration of power and a concentration of wealth that exercises far too much influence over politics, over society, and over the economy. That's like the old them thing. Now it's even when I was much younger, the old left me was the new left, part of the new left. So my version of left wing thought would have been heavily humanist. It would have been a belief that humans at their best are capable of creative labour, what Marx would have called artistic being. That the goal of politics is to try and liberate us from power to enable us to do that. As I've just been suggesting, I'm increasingly cynical and increasingly disillusioned about the prospects of that. But it's still, if you ask me what ideal would you like to try and realise, that's the ideal I would like to try and realise. I would like us to open our hearts, creative capacities, to reflect on our own beliefs, to develop them creatively, and to govern our lives, rule our lives, as we wish and as we want to, against the background of our reflection. And from that humanist perspective, I am also, in terms of the technology, really skeptical of AI. AI seems to actively undermines that humanism. Seems to put everyone gets the same answer. Everyone is treated as though there's one monolithic way of treating it. All the different voices that might be feeding into the algorithm are pulled together as though there's some sort of consensus within, which there never is. And then that consensus is thrown out. And there are areas, well, where I think that's really bad. I really do. I think in areas like giving people access to health information, that's extremely useful. But as a generic tool for governing how we conduct ourselves in life, I think it's a disaster. I think it's something that actively undermines our reason. So I disapprove of AI definitely as or high big tech as an industry. I am very skeptical and arguably hostile to AI as a particular tool and the role it currently plays in our lives. That's all I have to say. I think that's pretty much all I have to say. I mean, there's also, I guess, the issue of the role of AI in government. But my view of that sort of flows out of the two things I've just said. So flowing out of my dislike for big tech, I don't think the role of any technology, let alone AI, is to help us become freer human beings. Well, by freer, I mean really in the old-fashioned free, and I don't mean autonomous beings who have a set of beliefs and which we reflect on and change, and in accordance with which we make choices. I think essentially that's what it's about. I think it's about increasing the wealth and power of the people in government. And then in terms of its actual use within government and governance, the way of empowering people, what it says will happen. I think it does have a role. it has a rolling thing. And I think technology more generally has a role. The extent to which you can now get online banking through the phone. I've done a lot of work, I've just resigned, but the last 15 years I've done quite a lot of work for the United States. And the extent to which online banking on phone and the power that people, particularly in Africa, quite astonishing. It means they can have limited banking, where before they just used to have to store the money. Three to that, which enables you to do things you couldn't do before. Quite astonishing. For instance, it enables you to more securely give money to women. It might seem like a small thing, but it's incredibly important. Women tend to use the money for themselves, food, and their children, whereas men often use the money for prostitution and get drunk. So if you're actually trying to address a range of social problems, very, very important that money goes to women. And being able to put the money in bank accounts rather than hand over cash. Really good way of doing that. So I'm not suggesting tech never has benefits, but overall I think it's been done. I've been on the Metro bus number 1, my hotel in and out of the city centre all week. And if you go on that, 50% or more of the people on the bus are sitting there watching videos on their phones while they're on the bus. They're not talking to people, they're not looking around at the world about them. The videos are resolutely intellectual content that will make them reflect. How on earth that is, even if they are superficially enjoying it, how that is having the value of work for their long-term life project. Totally different. It worries me that from that point of view, we can see even the sale of iPhones or similar cell phones, something that is quite useful for someone like me. I can call off text, I can get text back, I can put on my email while I'm away from work. But what's going on is that the technology is increasingly being used. So it's not very different for people. Most of the big additions to phones in the last 10 years, I know mine's now 8 years old, are ones that add the superficial functions of the phone that you can enjoy on your privacy, like how glossy videos will look and how sophisticated they will appear, rather than things that actually help you to manage your life in a way that will make your long-term prospects better. And I think that's what, I don't mean it's quite as strongly as it's going to sound, but it's almost like you're selling people a drug. You're selling people something that will make them feel better now. But in doing so, you're eroding the long-term happiness they can find from their life project. But I'm very old. I'm very old, and old people always think technology is bad. And I think it's coming after them, so maybe I'm wrong.
Hi, my name is Cynthia, and I work for the Universidad for Costa del Norte. And I have a personal research area, which is governance. And I have found that there are a lot of a short story or history of the concept with a lot of changes. So nowadays we talk about governance, and most of the time we don't know what it's about because we speak about many things. The point is that many agents, what they put on the table, their idea with governance, it would be different from each perspective. Now what I'm trying to do in order to try to use this concept, I'm trying to build a methodology of governance, global governance, based on ideas and logic of social cybernetics and their social theory system, Carlos Garzons, of course, and with a critique view. Because social cybernetics start to be very mechanical. So the point to put the critical part is to put agents on place. Like let's talk about agency in social care system and see how it works. somehow the ideas I have been thinking of. And I wanted to ask you, what would be your advice or your perspective on doing this effort on global governance?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I'll start with the easy bit, because I'm quite all happy to say talk about that, and I don't worry how it might impact what you're doing. And that's kind of the history of the concept of government. I agree it's all over the place. Right? So I'll try and make it a bit more coherent than it might be. It really starts in government, not of the public sector, or state, but rather the private. It arises as a word that's designed to talk about, designed so that people talk about governance of the private sector companies, particularly in Anglo-American countries. 30s, 40s, worrying that the ownership so the owners are shareholders of the management. But people are influenced by neoclassical economics. They see that as the principal agent. So the issue is how you go to ensure that the management, the agent, act in accord with the interests of the principal. What you need is what they would call governance. And that's, I mean, it's way older. In English, private insurance, talking about equivalence of this and that. In our modern social science world, I think really starts there. And then it only really enters political science and public administration in the 70s, where people start to extend that analysis of corporate governance to the public. So neoclassical economics, rational choice theories, the things I was saying through earlier, they start to say, well, look, something similar is true in the public sector. They have the principles who are what? We the people, perhaps our elected representatives, but what you have is a load of agents who are the bureaucrats. And the bureaucrats go to pursue their own interests, not those of the principles. That's a really novel view. Really not new, right up until the 60s, 70s. The normal narrative of bureaucrats would have seen them as pursuing the public good. But the preference is people who are heavily influenced by their classical economics and rational choice theory, really with a very different theoretical lens to it. So the origins of the word government really is rational choice theory to take it one understand. Things to notice there is that the public region in the choice theory is interested in individual action rather than state. Talking about individual activity rather than the state set of institutions. When government then explodes is when a bunch of institutionalist, functionalist, system theorists, all the other people, social science, who I said, for instance, by functionalism, Marxism, etc., when they start to argue that the reform driven by this rational choice, so those reforms of a new public management, things like that, all these other forms of social science start to argue that those reforms have not created efficiency, they have not created markets. Instead, they have weakened the state, made it harder for the state to exercise control, and led to a proliferation and increase in the number of networks, which makes states increasingly problematic. Then you get all sorts of theories trying to discuss that world, a world in which state looks really messy. It's got markets and networks, and built legacies of hierarchy, and government tends to use them very. All these people, governance again, is not about traditional institutions of government. It's about the markets and networks that have now arisen, supplementing the state. That's why you have a plan. And I think there are two ways there of thinking how you might take the concept forward. One is you could adopt one of the sort of theoretical perspectives that are in play. So adopt the rational choice perspective, adopt the institution. And you can just say, from this theory, this is what governance is. And you can work with that definition. I think that's a more helpful way of thinking. What I like is that all of these theories challenge the idea of the state as a given entity. For various reasons, that idea is something that's very strong and powerful. So Marxists, on the one hand, Marxists have always thought of the state as an entity, an absolutely interesting category. Because that's how Marxists treat the social and political world, as it's a state or a reflection of economic forces. From another perspective, sociologists and political scientists have been very influenced by things like Weber's definition of state as a specific entity. Right? System theories again will often see the state, find the state as an entity defined by the functions that it plays within society. So social science often wanted to reify the state, reify works of Spanish term. You know what I mean by reify?
Yes.
Yeah. Treat the state as if it was an object independent of what we do. So like Marx would treat about religion. Right? So instead of seeing the state as something we produce through our activity, being as an object somehow defined. That's been really, really a dominant idea of social science. It seems to me that one useful function of the word government, across all these different ways of talking about it, and that idea of consent. They, instead of seeing the state as an object, you should see it as a series of ideally complex, sensible practices, people engaging, and there's something that doesn't have a clear boundary. And it's a state not to say, well, are we in the state now? You can have a vote on it. In a public institution, are we in the state? I don't know. Let's say we say we are in the state. My best guess, I don't know, but if I was in Britain, I would guarantee this is true. When I was a student, people who came into this room to clean it would have been university employees. Today, they will be contracted by the university to clean. So now let's imagine that's also true in Mexico. Even if we call this the state, do we want to call the cleaners the state? And the state's employing them, the state's paying them, but it's doing so through a contract. So the state has these blurred boundaries. In my opinion, that's always part of my human instinct. The state has always been about human activity, processes, practices, never been a reified object. So I really like the way in which the word governance draws our attention to the fact that we should think about the state in a decentralized way. So if I was looking for a uniform, if I was looking for something like a concept of governance rises out of all these aspects. The governance is about human activity, being it not as a reified object, but as a series of practices constructed out of human activity, contingent and contextual, and don't have clear boundaries. How do you say? I don't know what to say about your own research. A bit like I don't want to impose my views. I don't think that's helpful, particularly if you've already embarked upon research. So what I will do is again, I will tell you what my views will be, and then I will offer a slightly broader perspective. So in my opinion, there's an inherent conflict that you cannot solve system theory language. If you are going to explain something in system theory, you are going to say X is a product of the function that is performed within the system. That means agency has no place. And as soon as you say it's a product of agency, the agency is defining what happens rather than the system. So to me, there's an inherent conflict there. And there are only two ways out of it. And one is accept that really there is no agency to the way agency. And the other is to say, actually, I'm really committed the age name. It's a really the agency theory. Then the use of words like system or foreign. They're not doing any explanatory work. You can use them for what they are, descriptions of the product of agents. So they're metaphors that you are using to describe the world that arises out of the agency you're studying. They themselves do not explain what. So I think you need to make a choice between those perspectives. Be aware of having made that choice. Drive strongly on whichever choice. That's my opening. Having said that, it's large parts of the social science today. My views are very unpopular. Would not be necessarily settlement. And an awful lot of people would really like what you're doing and wouldn't be as concerned as I would be with the philosophical constitution within there. But you might choose to people call it budget, ignore the problem, hope it goes away, and just accept you've got those two languages in there, and perhaps at most at the end, write a conclusion where you reflect on the two languages rather than your stuff.
I am aware of this conflict, but I don't want to see conflict right. Like choosing by if I choose social security system, okay, I am going to find another. If I choose agency theory, I will find another conflict. But what is contradiction from how to detect the conflict from government?
My problem with that either we're agents or we're not. You can't say, oh yes, we're agents, but we're also governed by, our activities also governed by function. So I just think there is an irresolvable conflict. But let me try and be a bit more sympathetic. Right? So I think there are two ways of talking about our relationship with social. Once we go down the path we're trying to go down. And what I think we're trying to say is that on the one hand, there's this world here, lower world, let's call it, of our action. But above that, we definitely see what do we want to call it, patterns or institutions or systems. And we think that these patterns or institutions or systems somehow impact our agency. Clearly they do. I mean, you just put your hand up, right? And you did that because of your understanding of norms and patterns and how they work within an academic context. So there's no doubt that these patterns, norms, and somehow they seem to impact the world here. I think that's right, and that's why you can budget. Or why you can ignore the issue. But philosophically, I think there are two ways of conceiving the relationship between the activity and the pattern slash thing. One is you have a result of the activity. Have the activity, it generates a pattern slash thing. And that then creates a new set of activity. Way of thinking about it. Reifies the patterns of movements. It suggests that when we've acted, our actions create a pattern of system that somehow exists independent of those actions and then defines later activity. So that commits you to what Marxists of all new left Marx would have called reification, which is absolutely rampant in the faith. And those are the sort of reifications that appear in traditional notions. The other way of thinking about the relationship of this activity between patterns is that there's only the activity. That's all there is. Just these flowing practices and activities. And it's just that we, as either observers or participants, interpret that. And we see patterns in it. And our interpretations of it and of the patterns we see affect how we then go on and act. But that doesn't mean that there is an objective reified pattern that defines. So you can, if you want, you can fudge these. But philosophically, what you're doing is saying, am I seeing these patterns slash systems as reification that exist outside the activity and somehow define it? Well, I seem to be just descriptions of things I happen to see in this flux of activity.
Adelante.
Hello, my name is Pedro Estranda. I'm studying here PhD in social political sciences, and I want to follow with the discussion about structure and other levels of governance. And my topic of research is the professional trajectories of human rights. So I began to work with a concept of creative governance, trying to describe what happened in the management of this kind of projects, movies, TV, etc., and how all of them are drive from the top to the bottom of the top. And I didn't find too much literature around this topic. Most of the creative governance topic is related to with government, other institutions like unions, civil societies, etc. I see that it is a link between both levels, the governance for this level of institution and the management into the project and into the company. Like build a bridge into different level of governances, unions or government, laws, etc., and the management level. All of these have consequences in representation of minorities, international corporate rights, labor rights, etc. So I think at the end, it's like a circle that have interwoven consequences.
I'm going to echo my answer to the two other questions that I've asked first. But I'll start first with what I think, and then I'll talk about other options. So, having said that, earlier I said, I can't remember, I think very early on, I said that there's a testimony we trying to, I think it was trying to construct which we have a theoretical perspective. And then we're engaging in our study, and then we're asking how does that reflect? Because my theoretical perspective is hugely humanist, hugely historical, I actually think that often the study we're doing is primarily descriptive. I think there's been I think that the rise of formal social science really undervalued research. Often what we're doing is just going out and looking at something that we find really interesting, describing what we see, and relating that to other things. You know, oh, in this case, we see power over here, we see this group doing this, we see this discourse doing that, we can trace that discourse to there. And then maybe we want to tell a critical story about that, or maybe we want to tell an affirmative story about it. But what we're really doing is describing and then narrating the story according to what we want. I think some people don't like that way of thinking about what we're doing. It's failed to be generalization. You're not just describing minority filmmaking works in Hollywood, and that doesn't lead to a general theory about how filmmaking works globally, or about the role of minorities in American industries, no matter what industry you're looking at. Description of one area that happens to be, and it doesn't move up a more abstract general. I think people don't like that because they're locked into an idea. Once you move back to an abstract generalization, two things are true. One, you have a more general theoretical frame, and by definition, that. And two, when you move up to a more abstract general claim, then you can learn about other cases by deducing or deduction from that general claim. I dislike both of those ideas. So I don't like the idea that somehow moving up has got you a generalisation that has more conceptual power, because I think all it's got is a verification, or if you like, a symptom. And I worry about the loss of human agency, the loss of engagement with the verification. And I'm also critical of the idea that we learn well from generalisation. Think, for instance, of the disastrous effect people thinking that generalisations about marketisation, meaning that it was a good idea to unfold market reforms across Mexico or across large parts of Africa, right? Absolutely horrendous, but all rooted in the alleged claims about generalisation and its power. So I'm sceptical about those. But personally, I would prefer your interest in the particular case and describing it and I'm explaining the particular case, right, rather than trying to do that generalisation. What that means in terms of your question about bridging is that the way you find those bridges is not by postulating some sort of theoretical link. It's by saying to yourself, what links and connections do I see here in this particular case? Then describing them and using concepts that describe them. And then I think how we learn, and this is a bit like how you present your system theory reflections on what you can do in the conclusion. It's all about learning that by looking at the narrative, not by generalisation, but analogy. So what sort of critical work your research suggests we do when looking at, say, the film industry more generally? What might it imply for the analysis of the film industry within Latin America, where minorities are obviously different from those who might do that? What might it imply for the sorts of things we would look for if we were looking at the role of minorities in other American industries? They would try to suggest analogical conclusions rather than generalization. So that's how I would do it. The alternative, again, is to adopt a more formal theoretical perspective, which would define the concepts you use to refer to the bridging, and then try and push your empirical data, your observations into those theoretical categories. And then perhaps in the final chapter, reflect on the adequacy of those abstract theoretical concepts, and therefore your theory, for the particular case you're in.
My name is Rosario Vázquez. I am professor of ethics and methodology in business and management program. And my question is about methodology. Recently, more and more students are interested in digital. In some cases about politics, about more social definitions, about phenomena for digital platforms like media, and about that, what is your opinion about maybe digital ethnography or ethnography, like valid method in research, and some advices for these students that with your perspective in method or specific interest.
Actually, surprisingly neutral about methods. So I see methods as ways of gathering data. And that can include things that, from what I've said so far, it might sound that I'm quite hostile to, like surveying them. But if you say this is the data, it's not a survey, right? The data is the data. No one, you can't object to that. So I don't, in a way, methods aren't very interesting, right? They just generate data. How we explain it. And if I was to then go back to being critical about the rise of American-style quantitative methods, my problem is that those methods seem to suggest that if you apply them to create exploration and analysis of data, they will give correct explanation. For me, that's just plain and simple. No matter what data you have, it itself, no matter how you analyze it, can never guarantee a correct explanation. There's always a speculative moment inside those data. And that means that we have to be aware of what the data is actually telling. I mean, just really naive. If you do a voter survey and 80% of people tell you that they voted for Party X, that doesn't tell you that 80% voted for Party X. It tells you that 80% of answers the survey said they will vote for Party X. So there's always an interpretive aspect in the data. No matter what data you've got, you're then trying to interpret it in order to explain it. That happens with all the data. That would include digital oriented data. So I think that with those sorts of methods, as with any method, I actually like those sorts of methods. I lean towards more ethnographic methods. I think you're bound to lean to more ethnographic methods or particular case study methods if you are more humanist and more historicist like I am. So I like those methods. The interesting question will always be what explanations do you offer? And I guess that if you are asking me more specifically about digital stories as I understand them, I think that there is a potential fallacy that the story you capture on film somehow is true and explains it. Like the ethnographic, the equivalent to the regression analysis. The fallacy that your data is somehow pure and explains itself and doesn't need interpretation. And I think that's wrong. The one thing I would probably say to your students is to be aware of the extent to which they're constructing the evidence and the story they tell about it together within their digital.
Sí, por favor.
Thank you. My name is Raúl and I'm from San Luis Potosí, from and well, following this multiple correspondence analysis and my methodology or my research, and my question is, well, I identify two traditions that collide, and I try to capture the moment where they position themselves, and I try to capture this structure of governance, how much capital do we have in the problem. And I have two moments of the energetical transition or energetical reform. And how far can I go to explain this tradition from a state perspective? And if I wanted to talk or to dominant or that are related to way beyond the formation of the state even. Because before we called it the state, we have a field of power. And how can I translate practices from now? Practices of domination, mostly with other violence, no? They even have the dominant even they don't know if they are doing this willingly. No? And this is my question, referring to the position of how I can identify empirically this dilemma between these two positions. That can relate this to the origin of the state and
I think I might be missing your point. This is the first question I felt I might be failing. Say what I say, think the ad, come back to me and say that it sounds to me like what you're doing is something patterns of domination. I worry a bit, if it was me, but I worry a bit about your. I'm not sure how you do that. I'm really not, and I'm not sure you're particularly interested. I think what you're interested, and indeed you're asking what might be most interesting about the patterns you're discovering is not why they're there straightforwardly, but actually that they're there even if we don't realise. So they might be, so to some extent, I think the interesting drive behind all of them is again something we're tempted to see as less important, when actually it's often a real important, which is a descriptive research. And what you're doing is saying, look, these patterns are out there. If I'm right about that, then there's a sense in which, instead of thinking about what you're doing by going back to the origin, say, straightforwardly explaining what it will be doing will be tracing the rise of the patterns, contrasting them with the patterns that existed at an earlier moment, right? So I think if that makes sense, I think we have two alternatives. Again, the alternative, which is the one I would adopt, is to accept that's what you're doing and say, these are the patterns I found, this is why they're interesting, they have this critical purchase, here is the policy implications of them, particularly if we want to correct the sort of patterns I found, we might try this. Here is the speculation as to why they've arisen. That would be one option. Another option would be to try and identify some sort of formal and to hope you can find statistical evidence that the formal cause is that which somehow creates the patterns that you find. Personally, I would say, even if you find statistical evidence, it doesn't show what you're then saying. A lot of methodology that would be a good bit of research in mainstream research.
Post that institutional or functionalist view probability checking balances. And they are missing that those institutions are they have power, they have have been dominant before those institutions. They are trying to legitimate their previous power. For instance, the privilege of not knowing. At the top of the bureaucracy, sometimes they ignore it. For instance, in Mexico, we have the Secretary of Security with things that the president ignores. And sometimes this is an informal institution, not written, but no, let's keep away the president from this topic, this subject, no, you take a decision. And this is what I try to make sense from.
Right, so I mean, there it sounds to me like what you're doing is the patterns you're showing are designed to establish that a bunch of institutions and policies are not operating in the way that they were advertised. And I think you're suggesting that the reason for that is that they weren't founded to operate they were founded and that sounds perfectly simple to me. That's all over the place, like, but it's a hard thing to show. Because if you look at the policy documents and the official rhetoric, you're not going to find people saying, oh, we're trying to retrench our power. So the only evidence you can really offer is that people's activity. What you can say is, irrespective of what they say, their actions suggest that these are their real motivations. And that's that. I think that's a reasonable critical move. It's quite hard to document. It's going to be quite slim, so I wouldn't put too much weight on that probably in the research, but it's certainly worth adding in. And then I think another strong point of it is once you've established that they operate like X, the obvious question would be, well, how might we modify? So then you're opening up a door to kind of questions about how we introduce reforms or different participation mechanisms, which brings us back to these questions about, and the very first one about the future of social science. Not only am I pessimistic there, I'm sad to say I'm actually deeply pessimistic on democracy in that sense. I think the sort of thing you're discovering is everywhere. And I think that even the kind of more participatory radical forms of democracy for most of my life I strongly favour, I still like them. I actually think they are basically increasingly techniques that elites can use to control governance for their own purposes rather than to actually for our liberation. And the final thing I'll say is, I think you've seen that overlap between my pessimism there about democratic practice or action and my pessimism about social science. Things like the literature on deliberative democracy. So the literature on deliberative democracy is now overwhelmingly rooted in social sciences, offering a formal expertise through which they will tell us when deliberative democracy best works, how it best works, what's the... So then it just becomes yet another technical governing instrument designed to control us in the form of their expertise, rather than something we actually use to engage one another in dialogue, try to understand one another, empathize with one another, and resolve our differences. I think the whole world is drifting towards this technocratic system. So that even if I try to promote more dialogic, participatory forms of democracy, which might be your aim at the end, what's the depth you have? Once they move through the world of formal social science and formal policy advice, just more techniques.
Más quisiera con el diálogo. So I have also a question. In Mérida, you went. We had a panel in which Cristina Puga, Paco Porras, and Gerardo Torres Salcido participated, and the panel was the future of governance as a concept and as a theory. So I would like to hear some thoughts about from you about this topic. Do you think that governance concept and maybe theory will be useful for the next years?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, if I was to give a bold answer, it would be no. And the no would be rooted in my pessimism, which is no matter what concept we come up with, no matter what we do with it, will be transformed into these modernist ways of thinking, and it will be used to develop new technologies of governmentality, which will be ways of. I don't think I'm actually really. I wish I wasn't. I really do. I wish, but I'm really pessimistic. The world seems to me to be one of ever greater use. It seems to me that two things are true. One, social sciences are becoming ever more about developing formal, abstract generalizations and models, and less about theoretical and critical drive. And it seems to me, secondly, that governments are becoming, on the one hand, ever more willing to draw on this formal social science, and on the other hand, ever more willing to do so in pursuit of what they see as their own interest. So that you get both reification, bad forms of knowledge, combined with overt attempts to pursue their own self-interest stating that bear almost no resemblance to what they're actually doing. I just don't see the world being built. But if I try to be a bit more positive, then I do think that government has this really useful function or consequence of doing away with traditional models. I think that's good. But it's only good if we can say that what's going on there is that we're drawing attention to the fact that the state is a contingent and contestable product of activity without human activity, and it doesn't have clear boundaries. If instead we start to say that the state is not a monolithic entity, but it's composed of markets, networks, or any other thing we care to mention, and then we see those markets, networks, and systems as defined by some sort of social or functional logic, then I think why bother with the term government? Really doing just what the term state used to do. Right? Which is offering us a formal account of the institute, highly institutions in our society, and it's exploring those slightly more broadly. But it will continue. It will continue because the state is not going to. We're not going to go back to a world where we see the state straightforwardly a hierarchical bureaucracy. So the world government will continue. Whether or not it's useful depends on whether or not we see that complexity of the state in terms of human activity or in terms of something or social.
¿Alguien más quisiera hablar sobre su investigación y dar algunas? Sí, por favor. Sí, te ayudamos aquí entre todos. No te preocupes.
A mí está muy complejo. Se ha compartido cosas muy valiosas. Estoy en día, entonces es el primer semestre y estoy muy interesada en las civilizaciones, la política y la religión. Específicamente,
Si quieres, ahí voy dando, so Fernanda is a master in she's interested in civilizations. ¿Me repites, por favor?
política, religión.
Face of civilization, politics, and religion.
En este sentido, la conversación, hablamos sobre el Estado es una actividad humana. Y bajo el entendimiento de lo que hablábamos del liberalismo, tanto el liberalismo parte de una visión ontológica, o pensando en los teóricos del liberalismo, que hay una concepción ontológica e incluso de valores, acorde a la civilización dentro de su época.
So Fernanda is asking, taking into account that liberalism si ontological level, ¿cómo lo preguntaste?
¿De dónde vienen estas creencias de ciertas teorías que actualmente utilizamos? Por ejemplo, el liberalismo, que ya se preguntaba de qué circunstancias creencias junto que se tienen esas teóricas y ciertos conceptos. Entonces, se preguntaba el sentido de la gubernamentalidad, pensándolo también en tiempo, saber el poder que sostiene una época. En esta cuestión de teorizar, que tanto también por o entendimiento ontológico de la realidad, que posibilitan, por ejemplo, ahorita lo del liberalismo, es como entenderlo bajo una concepción específica, pero que parecía de concebir al ser humano como algo malo, pensando específicamente en cómo.
Next to the theme of the
The ideas define the concept of ontological perspective of where we can, there is a way we can find it. And I should give the example of government,
Yeah.
because like, how is that it got to that point, and from then on, now, where is this breaking point, and how can we get to the basic, the origin and the ontological origin?
I think you think. Like, so I'm very interested, for instance, in the way in which liberalism created that process or experienced that process within liberalism.
Igual de éxito, pero la transición, como entiendo, yo
Yeah, but what I also use the Christianism as an example of how David's made theory from the beginning, they developed the decades or centuries, and they are changing and from what we got now, and they are different from the beginning. See, from the first one.
sí, cada uno tiene sentido, y dar esa cuestión de la religión, poderlo reproducir la democracia. Nosotros ahora podemos analizarlo porque, como bien lo decía, el desarrollo de esta actividad humana es importante de la formación, que también ya no puede ser utilizado de acuerdo
How related democracy and the state.
de democracia
That question about contemporary values. Now, frequently, because of how we explain or how we look at previous or origins. Again, I'll say that I think if you're interested in broader patterns, so you're not actually thinking of them. You're interested in, say, positions of democratic thought around modern medicine. The basic principle to say is if you have trouble with them, I'm not trying to distract. Plan that. So if you think that's well, it's going to sound really like that's the first thing. Well, I a bit more interesting if I go on. But obviously the first thing is to read through the template. And as you read them, you have to say, well, what? Saying the whole using it saying it critically, and maybe you want to know what I don't say the reason responsibility for I thought, and good explanation of I find that there's change. There's one challenge, another is done in one. So maybe you can have some information, by the but now I think I guess the principles regarding the three. More than 10 America. It's really the last imagine the reason for the dead package. I would think of the principles the change. And we have seen this standard. Earlier, we was permitted to have the working line stuff through part of the studies, where all these kinds of something else structure against the forward. So the easy way to do it, they define the structure. So, and that structure will be very important to us. So, it has no way of developing the but doing it not going to be about almost the mechanism of start. That's actually is that's not a violation. And it's not safe. So there's no detail that comes down in the grade 8. There's a layer of detail that quite clearly rejects. Quite clearly rejects that. You need to on. And basically, they lose the energy. Starting to speak like I just said, practice and do that finish. But basically, everything is on the floor. Don't they want something? Whereas I did, very long time to explain it. There's just not an restriction. But we're not. Dropping the item. So there's a very simple form of book. It doesn't appear to me. Yeah. Doesn't appear to me that that makes no sense to me. It doesn't appear to me but any event of information is not fair to what you we bring you something to the because now you can just that's very different things. Lots of dogs. But we don't have to explain. And I think the way to go about it is made it. Quite difficult. Some things really don't like acknowledging their individual. That's one. I think that's even clear in the sense which was developed in this stuff. But the thing really is in many ways the family international. They don't say that because they become the religion. And if not, where are the influences on the food? And obviously, to some extent, that's part of the spectrum to that. They from the it's staying out there and lots of family has been looking at that. I think quite clear to me. Farmers approach here, on present with people I haven't said, personally, there's secondly, French speaking plan. Already done. I can't do so about the still about reality being so psychiatry, but you can also say physics. History of reality, it's not so it's benefit that it's one people it's rational or rational and the ability for instruction was the built out of that. Salaries, but then the significant change, just like you know, companies, real launches. I don't want to be relatively dogmatic about how it was played. I think it's a kind of generally aware of information. Reacher, maybe that's more. Which is very difficult. That's about you. It's very on that. It's very like institutional in some issues and the book. The president can get really first back that review. In fact, dive away from the source of the but it's something that's that explains about whole reaction. All the rising problem, right? So you might say, oh, Mexico, the problem, there who's going to be how many respond to that problem. Right? How will we go to use the UTW as a but back to the issue of the I think it's more that's wrong. I was talking about structures and whether it's talking about realities. He's strongly together with the problem is institution. What things was control the people? That's the reaction. People that they see, people that we see, doesn't allow them. But we see in convention. In a mostly now. But just not something that out to the church, they become but not in our country. Basically, so kind of institutional and the but I think that's very quite able to quite rational. And the young people, the people they died. There's a thing we are these things are young. I agree with that. That's the granted I think my view really strongly understand. Unclear what the that creates all sorts of problems for instance, suddenly I'm having a solution. So presently, internet, why regard to the free, we become presently. Even a start, very, very low. But if it becomes regular, so I will kind of turn it into a nice space to start all these problems. Because it's actually, I think, really I'm thinking that it's far away from simply transgressing. I think I will say, in the next little while, this notion, interventions, human interventions, as having a capacity, the practical argument, change, and vision, vision, I'm sharing because there's action for no really chance, really chance. I think that space of freedom, that space of freedom, even a sense of people. Probably believe that space. Shoot, I can conceive of myself in relation to that way. It wouldn't make sense for me to live my life. It's innocently, blatantly, understanding it in family. These mean the place of knowledge in our world study, the principle of understanding in our world study. And there are some under money. I believe that our capacity range is especially in the now the problem from time to time. Everyone is self-teaching student. That is the I don't but it has been internalized. That is all the people. Yeah. So there's a fair bit of things wrong. The other device is basically human intelligence. That's how technology is enough. Mainly, taken down was there. And in doing so, and to be underlying space for us I've been reading because I know the help. So I just say, look, if we have a big base of we also start going. So probably next people should something which is the spend that has to be trained, spend that has to be fulfilled. You want to keep that space open. You want to continue that. Think of the other, in something like systems theory or institutions theory. Well, think of the landscape, no matter what other constitution. Think about the happens in Nigeria. The idea from the old elections. Yeah, it's which interact with one another. So that's but I think that's not just that we are but the world is food process becoming more it's basically I actually think food comes rather than it's a short question. But I'm happy to share that. Don't know president France in August, France again. It's a bit of way to explore the cheap. It's sense there and and then schools and friends and they learn in these are historical achievements. How much we need to compare, but that's it. Very Quisiera hacer alguna pregunta o algún comentario. Si no hay nadie más, let me ask you a final remarks on as you were mentioning during your last conference. How to make social studies fun? This idea of creativity within circumstances, different approaches, and how do you feel it? I think what I have in mind there really is, it's the same thing. I'm going to start before I take more about it. Yes, it's the same thing. In a sense, I think you have these methods, maybe not just in generating knowledge, that is the right way to start. If you don't do that, then it's besides that, people have the more are they there are ways they need to find it seems to be that the personalization method with village with the idea of certain methods to generate information. Personalization method requires these methods but they don't generate knowledge in a way that once the record I don't want to suggest the explanation you had about them. That creates a street in people having actually and this way that we like to. Another problem is we get some analysis using then it means that we are free and credit. So definitely there's something still about theories. And the things of the right time. Normally, I think it's creative, playing. So what we need to find, It's going to be one way of doing it because I think that's what I can do there about. I'm not sure what they or but I hopefully feeling that. It's not going to be something that looks like you can see that so I think it's really important. But then the third thing is I think that recognizing the lower tree me opens up space to being space for being more dialogical and social. You don't have dialogue in something that really is going in that say, oh, what good? Right, well, let me shoot this one. What's that good? How do you change it? Think up shared space and more slowly rather than the kind of dialogue of medicine. This is the absence of the dependencies on the information of the energy. Thank you very much.
Thank everybody joining this session. Thank you for having us to talk about this issue, but I know that it was very easy. That entonces, doctora, y join us to participate in this technique. Thank you, doctor. Have a good year. Now, I don't
Students, we need to know the story about the people that's and so that everyone
Yes.
Carlos, thank you a lot. With your moving number. Okay.